Now, to Marx, conflict over resources is the driving force of human action and, by extension, of history, of social change. And in particular, he's going to be focused on class conflict, conflict between social classes, where class is defined by one's relationship to production, essentially by one's role within the economic system. And he sees society as consisting essentially of two pieces. There's what's called a mode of production. We would call that an economic system. A mode of production, a set of institutions, a set of rules which define how resources are distributed, how production is to take place, how the fruits of production will be distributed, who gets what, who does the work. And around, in order to support that mode of production, there's what's called a superstructure, a complex of cultural ideas and values which exist to give legitimacy to the mode of production and sustain people's faith in it. Now, the superstructure can include smaller things like the customs of a people, the clothing they wear, the food they eat, the holidays they celebrate, that kind of thing that we call culture. But Marx is more concerned with the ideas aspect of culture, the values that a culture promotes, the beliefs that the culture holds, the political systems it uses to govern, and the religion that it uses to form its basic worldview. See, Marx is a cynic. With our other economists, we tend to find them either ambivalent on religion, it's just not really relevant to what they talk about, or they tend to be supportive of it in some fashion. Back when I taught you about Adam Smith, I think I might have said that we're not really sure if he was religious or not. But since then, I've actually met a Smith scholar, and he told me, oh, yeah, he was. Smith had a huge bone to pick with atheists. Well, Marx is the opposite because he's an atheist, and he has a huge bone to pick with Christians and Jews. And he says, infamously, religion is the opium of the masses. Religion is a trick that the upper class plays on you in order to make you support things that go against your own interests, that give you what he would call a false class consciousness. You get people to identify with things that are not in their real nature. This applies to nationalism. Marxism at the start is going to be anti-nationalist. Later on, this changes in practice. When it actually comes time to run communist countries, they end up embracing nationalism whole hog. But in its theoretical roots, Marxism opposes nationalism. Marxism opposes racism. Marxism opposes what come across as being arbitrary institutions of society. It's generally going to be very friendly to women's liberation, and it definitely always opposes religion because it's believed that the religion of a society tends to support the status quo within the society. It's constructed very deliberately to make people acquiesce in their own exploitation. The word actually slipped my head for a moment. And often you'll see communists are the first to support social change. And sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's bad, depending on what specific social change we're talking about. And this also ties into another thing called the Frankfurt School and critical theory. The Frankfurt School developed critical theory. In the news lately, you hear people calling it critical race theory. Sometimes you hear people call it cultural Marxism. These aren't exactly wrong terms, but it's not the terms that the Marxists use themselves. So it sounds a little ignorant when you use the wrong term, but what these Frankfurt School guys wanted to do was they had to explain why uh, the workers weren't revolting, essentially. Why was the Western working class rejecting communism? And their explanation was the superstructure of the West is just so effective that it's keeping them bamboozled. And if we want to undermine the superstructure to topple the capitalist system, or sorry, if we want to undermine the mode of production to topple the capitalist system, we've got to undermine the superstructure first. If we chip away at the arbitrary distinctions between people, the arbitrary rules of our culture, then we can get people to stop thinking of themselves in terms of identity groups and instead start thinking of themselves in terms of being workers. We give them a true class consciousness. The irony of this is that they, after several decades of this stuff, because your Frankfurt School first really becomes influential in the 1960s. You think of the 60s, 70s era radicals on college campuses. Well, after several decades of this, they kind of lost track of the plot and ended up basically recreating their own superstructure. The the ultimate goal of undermining the superstructure to bring in a new communist society ended up getting derailed through endless culture war for its own sake. Now, Marx believed that each mode had its own internal conflicts, and these conflicts resolve themselves into the next mode. I don't particularly care that you know what Hegelian dialectics are, but that is a phrase you often hear in reference to it. Hegel was a German philosopher. He was obsessed with this idea of like recombination and change. And what a dialectic is it's a sort of scenario where you have an idea, what's called a thesis, and that idea by existing necessarily implies its own opposite, what's called antithesis. But the tension between the two cannot last forever. An idea and its own direct contradiction can't survive. It'd be like having matter and antimatter interacting. I hope I used that right. I don't know physics. So eventually, they're going to have to kind of reform and meld into each other into what's called a synthesis. The idea and its opposite come to compromise and meet each other and evolve into something new. Well, Marx takes this idea of the Hegelian dialectic because he's a huge Hegel fanboy, and he applies it to human society because he sees society as having this evolutionary process. A mode of production has its own internal conflict. It has its own class conflicts. It has its own contradictions, and it's generally unsustainable. But that mode of production will eventually end up leading to another mode of production. Marx does not think of the world in terms of equilibrium. He doesn't think in terms of society reaching some sort of ideal state. Rather, he thinks of the world in terms of it constantly evolving, and he thinks that the process is inevitable. This goes back to him being a materialist, because as a materialist, he believes that everything is about resources. He believes that everything in society is very mechanistic. That's another thing he has in common with Smith, but he takes it in a totally different direction. Society is like this machine. And so if we know the initial settings of it, then we should be able to predict what direction it's going to go in. And there's nothing you can do about the process. individual human action is not able to steer the ship on any other course. It's just too weak, and people are products of their environment. Now, it's not real important that you know all his different modes of production, but the big the big thing is Marx begins with what he calls primitive communism. It's more or less an accurate description of reality. When you look back at hunter gatherers and early Neolithic man, so people who had developed farming but not civilization yet, they tended to live in stateless, egalitarian societies. Early man knew no government, knew no masters, knew no ruler. Early man lived in extended kinship groups, and he shared everything within that kinship group. Everybody knows each other, right? Everybody knows each other, so everybody takes care of each other because they're all family at some level. But the problem was, once people developed agriculture, the population density started to increase until eventually you get societies where not everyone knows each other. And you also start to get some groups establishing control over other as well. You get the emergence of serfdom. And this leads to several different modes of production. There was the ancient mode of production, which revolved around slavery and tribute. There was the tributary mode of production, the Asiatic one, which revolved around very powerful centralized governments controlling people through a bureaucracy, like, say, China, a lot of Middle Eastern empires, empires in India. And there was also feudalism. But in general, the main thread through all of these was control of land. Now, that nobility could be more dispersed. You have countries like Poland where 10% of the population is nobility, or it could be very, very narrow. You have countries like ancient Egypt where the pharaoh owns over half the land himself. But again, it's an agricultural world. It's a world without fossil fuel. It's a world where if you want more output, you have to have more people, which means you have to have more land. And so those who own the land are always going to be in the driving seat of events. What changes is that eventually you get to the capitalist mode of production, a society where the primary source of wealth is going to be capital, machinery. And in this capitalist mode of production, labor is going to be wage labor. Labor is going to be something to be traded, and everything is traded, either in competitive or monopolistic markets. But the key here is the market. This is the world of Smith, the world we've been studying. And Marx is going to divide society up into 4 groups based on their relationship to the means of production. There's other social classes he has to talk about, but they're not real relevant to what we're doing. So some of these terms I've already used, but I have this laid out like a Nolan chart. You have 2 axes. One on, do you own the means of production? Do you own capital and land and all that junk? And the other is, do you work the means of production? Because when Marx talks about a worker, he pretty much always means the literal workers. He doesn't consider management work. Now, those who own but who do not work, he calls bourgeois. So if someone has a business, but they're not, literally running the machine themselves, they're not tending tables, they're not plowing the field, these people he calls bourgeois. Then you have those people who do own, but they also work as well. That would be your self-employed craftsman. That would be a lot of your professional types, like the doctors and lawyers who tend to, they run their own little business out of their house. This would be your pioneer farmers. But all these people in the modern day, I tend to say tradesmen. In the modern day, these people are the petit bourgeois. They are bourgeois because they own the means of production, but they're petit because they're not so large as to be able to hire other people to do their work for them. This is the social class that American society was essentially founded on. You do have a bourgeois in early America. You do have a nobility in the form of the, Southern slaveholding aristocracy. But the vast majority of America was petit bourgeois of some form in our revolutionary days. Collectively, this end of the spectrum are I'm going to call them natural liberals. Then you have the proletariat. And proletariat are those who work but who do not own. Employees, wage laborers. But especially much of the time when Marx talks about proletariat, he really means factory workers specifically. And then finally, you have the lumpen proletariat. And you never really hear about these guys, but they're the people who do not own and do not work. Criminals, welfare honeys, just general leeches on society, beggars. Beggars would count too. They don't really have a welfare state when Marx is writing. But if they had one now, he would count them. One big thing to note, a lot of modern communists and their sympathizers tend to overlook this. Marx hated these people. Marx thought they should be liquidated because they don't pull their weight. And that tends to be the attitude of most communist regimes. Unemployment is outlawed. Of course, the government will give you a job if you go to them, but they don't tolerate people lazing around. The irony of it is that, in a way, Marx kind of was one of these guys. Because although he was a newspaper man, he did publish, he never made enough money to support his family. He refused to get a real job. And mostly he just bummed off of his friend Friedrich Engels. Now, Friedrich Engels didn't have his own money either. So Marx is bumming off Engels. Engels has to bum off someone else, which meant Engels' daddy. And you know who Engels' daddy was? A factory-owning bourgeois. So the jokes that people make about communists being just lazy shitheads are essentially correct. Like, not, the rank and file that fought in these revolutions, they were working class people. But the founder of the ideology himself, he actually was, a lazy bum. Marx had other stuff he wrote where he talked about how much how awful working is.